The summer's day heat radiated around her. Cecilia looked towards the face of the sun and smiled. Her journey was taking her down a long country lane, towards home. She felt happy, she would see her family again, and she defied anyone not to be happy with weather such as this. Just a bit further down the road before her lay a green field, with cows lazily grazing. Her house lay across the field, so she looked for the stile she knew was round the corner. As she looked, some gulls circled overhead, and she could hear their wings beating as they flew. No stile, she realized, and proceeded further down the lane, looking for another means of access. As she walked, a sudden chill bit the air. The hedge seemed to grow taller around her, and cirrocumulus clouds flicked across the sun. "How can I get in?" she thought, and a faint hint of unease struck her. The mocking cry of the gulls seemed echo all around as she hurried back up the country lane, and, as she surveyed the field she had seen before, her heart sank as its area increased beyond sight before her eyes. Phineas Nigellus woke with a start. He shuffled round in his frame, slightly annoyed at being awoken from a very pleasant sleep. The voices of the current occupants of his house came through the open study door, and he moved round to a better eavesdropping position. 4 days, he heard a woman say, and recognized it as the witch who came to reallocate the dust every so often in the study where he hung. "Do you think Dumbledore should tell her family?" "Has he said anything new?" said a man. "Dumbledore? Sirius. What was that? Young Sirius, eh?" thought Phineas, as he leaned against the frame edge. He remembered when his great-grandson was small, sitting in his father's chair and asking him questions about his family and the wizards therein, and sometimes about grass and trees and birds. Then he had grown, and turned his back on his heritage. Young men today. "Remus has been with her since Saturday. I think he feels some responsibility. Sirius told him he was sorry. Molly, you know he's been climbing the walls now the ministry has been closing in on him. Sirius is the closest Harry has to a father. How is he coping with it?" "Harry's upset, all the children are. They saw Remus carry Cecilia upstairs." Ah, he recognized that voice. His great-granddaughter. Didn't her mother marry a mole? At least she had the good sense to give her a good, solid traditional name. Dumbledore spoke to him. "Harry hasn't spoken to anyone about it. It's probably best to leave him be for the meantime. No one's seen Snape since last Saturday. Really thought he was going to have Sirius's head off. I am so glad Dumbledore arrived when he did, Tunks. I couldn't honestly be sure that Severus wouldn't have killed him there and then. Should someone tell him? No. There's nothing to tell, if you think about it. Poppy says if she doesn't come out of it today, it won't look good. Her heart will get weaker and she'll slowly die. Now she's running along a beach, through the sand. The atmosphere is calm, the waves are lively lapping at the shore. It is most idyllic and peaceful. The sand is soft underfoot, but Cecilia barely notices, as she hurries across it. She can't find them. Where are they? Are they still here? The waves roll up the shore, and Cecilia searches the horizon. And then she sees them. Mum and Amy are waiting for her. They're on the other shore. Freya is waving. And Libby too. And they're calling her. Cecilia. Cecilia. The room slowly came into focus and Cecilia blinked as the bright light stings her eyes. She looked around her, raising her hand up to her face. That was some night, she thought, and coughed in response to the slowly tightening feeling in her chest. Someone is holding her hand, she realized, and his expression changed from worry to a friendly smile. Glad to see you are with us again, said a man holding her hand, smiling down at her gently. She blinked again, and the room came back into focus. This wasn't her room, not her bed. Where was she? She looked round the room, slow realization dawning that she wasn't at home with a hangover from drinking all night with Libby. She was. Where? She raised her other hand to her head. She had a splitting headache. Why? She began, before being shushed. There, now, he said, smiling kindly. You've been out of it for almost 4 days. We were beginning to worry about you. 4 days? Thought Cecilia. She tried to raise herself up in the bed, but pain in her back shot through her. She grimaced, and looked round the room, trying to work out where she was, and then looked back to the man. You're safe, he continued. His voice sounded familiar, and she looked at him, questioningly. Remus, he said gently. You drank something that disagreed with you. At work, he added. Why don't you tell me what you remember? That might help. Your age, for instance? Where you live. 28. She tried again to hoist herself up onto the pillows but slumped back as white-hot pain seared momentarily down her left-hand side. She winced, and breathed out heavily, coughing slightly. This isn't where I live though. She added. Remus, she thought. Why do I know that name? Lie still, said Remus, stroking her hand. Cecilia looked down at her hand, and then followed a hand up until she was looking at his face, which was full of concern, his pale eyes betraying tiredness and worry. She held his gaze for a few seconds before she winced again as the pain dug in sharply near her ribs. Cecilia closed her eyes. She felt tired, and her headache seemed to be getting worse, and she felt him stroke his finger lightly across the back of her hand. When she was asleep, Remus slowly slipped his hand from hers and paused to glance at her asleep for a moment, before striding quickly out of the room and downstairs. Phineas strained at the confines of his frame so as to pick up the fading conversation. He cursed his own mortality for not being able to move so as to better hear what was being said. Heaven knows how he must be feeling. You know how much he looks up to Sirius. Do you think he will still go through with it? It's for the order. Against you know who. But if she never wakes up, if she dies. What will happen then? Dumbledore will talk to him again, no doubt. What were they talking about? Thought Phineas, moodily. They'd mentioned you know who, and Phineas recalled that he was broadly in favor of those ideas of his. And did one of them say there was a mole upstairs? It certainly would not have happened if he'd been alive, he thought, shaking his head. Remus, what is it? She's come to. Cecilia. Quick, get Dumbledore. Quickly, Bill. Poppy. Yes, she woke up. Oh my. Tunks. Cecilia. Come on, I might need your help. Her problems might just be beginning. The living. Huh. What do they know about problems? They don't know they're born, half the time, he thought bitterly. It's when you're dead, that's when the trouble begins, what with the loneliness. Dust. Flaky paint. This time her dream was different. She was searching for something. The moor she was standing in was growing darker, and she was aware of the shape behind her, following her. She continued to walk across the moor, looking for something. Someone. But couldn't quite remember what for. Or who. She had a nagging thought in the back of her mind telling her she knew she shouldn't have been there, and her mind chided her for ignoring the warnings. The thing behind her was getting closer, the padding behind her making her heart race slightly, and she looked round for a weapon. The dusk settling in round her as she went made the moor appear inhospitable. 1 or 2 lights many miles ahead kept her focus. Her mind began to race. It wasn't a matter of if the beast behind her would attack, but when, and no sooner had she thought this, its pace increased, jumping to one side of her. Cecilia turned to run, but was prevented from making much headway by 2 extruding basalt outcrops, and the animal, something of a huge black canine, bared its fangs and backed her into it. Her mind was blank with fear. She knew she couldn't run and there was no one about. The animal backed her further towards the rock face, saliva dripping from its protruding teeth, and a wave of terror washed over her. That was it. The end. She was done for. But then, Someone jumped in front of her, holding out their hands toward it. She knew this person. She could almost feel who it was. A pain in her side caused Cecilia to wake with a start, and she blinked muzzily, realizing it had only been a dream. Then she noticed there were people round her, looking at her intently. She recognized one of the people, the man with the beard and the robes. What was his name? And the woman? Kindly, homely face, worry-etched with a nervous smile. Remus, the man who had held her hand just then, was also there, and another woman, dressed like a nurse. She looked from face to face, trying to piece things together in her mind. Cecilia, said Dumbledore, as her gaze eventually returned to him. Dumbledore. Yes. That was right. She tried to get her mind to focus on something she knew about him as he continued. We were all quite worried, he continued, approaching the bed. Cecilia tried to straighten up, but he waved his hand vertically to indicate that she didn't need to. I can understand your confusion, he continued. The potion you inadvertently consumed is known to be toxic to moles. You are very lucky to be here. He looked round at the other people. Would you mind leaving us for a moment? I need to have a word with Mrs. Frobisher in private. She watched as Remus and Mrs. Weasley. Yes. Left, hearing her yelling up the second flight of stairs. The other woman put down the flask she was holding and, smiling at Cecilia, followed her. Dumbledore pulled across a chair next to the bed. Cecilia tried to move herself further up, and grimaced as the pain coursed through her. Dumbledore smiled sympathetically, and patted her right hand. Madame Pomfrey says you will be fine now you're awake, Cecilia. However, I must warn you, there may be some lasting harm. How do you feel at the moment? Tired, she said, considering her pounding head. Confused. I don't remember much, Professor. She sighed, hopelessly. What happened to me? He smiled at her again, acknowledging her request for information. Before I answer that, Cecilia, I need to ask you, what do you remember? Take your time, but it is vital I know everything. What do I remember? She thought to herself. It all seems so confusing. I remember you, Professor, and Mrs. Weasley. She stopped, trying to reorder the scenes flashing in and out of her mind. There was a street selling broomsticks. We went shopping. Tunks and I. We bought some clothes. Remus. She stopped and frowned, considering what she remembered about Remus Lupin. Take your time, reminded Dumbledore gently. The order meeting. You proposed me as a member. It nearly didn't happen, but someone voted in favor. And then I went to bed. She sighed. That was it. She went to bed. So how was she lying here days later? Is that everything, Cecilia? Do you remember nothing else? At the prompt, her mind clicked over, as if another tea chest of memories had washed up on her cerebral beach. Thinking about it, she said slowly, I got back up. She looked at Dumbledore, determined to get across the vital information she was even now unpacking. I didn't go straight to bed. The man, at the meeting. Sirius. Realization dawned on her face. He was downstairs. She looked at him questioningly. Dumbledore rose, and began to pace. I will not deny what happened, Cecilia. On Saturday you were attacked, resulting in you becoming unconscious. He sighed, and looked at Cecilia, conveying the gravity of the situation. Attacked, thought Cecilia, searching her memories. She shook her head slightly. Sirius had been drinking. However, I must add, I am telling you that not as an excuse or to justify his actions. Indeed, they are far from justifiable. You've been unconscious for 4 days. He threatened to kill you, Cecilia, I am afraid to say. Kill me? Said Cecilia, her voice cracking because of her dry mouth. She coughed. I don't remember. What do I remember? She tried to think back to the memory of Sirius. We drank tea. Yes. I was reading. She broke off and swallowed Remus's book. she added, glancing at mysterious mythology on the table beside her. He is sorry for it, Cecilia, and regrets harming you. As a member of the Order you are afforded the protection and are most welcome to remain here. He stopped pacing and stood by the side of the bed. You don't have to decide now. Take your time. She barely recognized Dumbledore's words, however, because of the confusion that had overtaken her mind. She coughed, and Dumbledore patted her hand. What will happen now? She asked, frowning. You need to regain some strength before we can decide that. Don't worry, you are quite safe now. Remus has barely left your side, we were all quite worried. Remus. The image of his face entered her mind, and she recalled his warm breath on her neck the very first time they met. You need some rest, some time to get your strength back, he said, heading towards the door. Try and sleep, Cecilia, you'll feel much better. And with that, he left. Sirius, she thought, as she sank back under the covers. He seemed so nice. The world round her grew warm and dark and she drifted back off to sleep. 88,888,888. It seemed like only a few seconds when Cecilia reawoke, but it was much later in the day. Long shadows cast themselves on the opposite wall and she realized that Remus was by her side again, holding her hand. Some water for you, he said, smiling, and gestured towards the others in the room. You have some visitors, if you're up to it. Cecilia smiled back at Remus and sat up, ignoring the pain as she tried but failed to get to a more comfortable position. Dumbledore was also there, she noticed, and Mrs. Weasley, with the twins, and she noticed a look pass between them. The children, began Mrs. Weasley awkwardly. That is, I am afraid to say it was my sons, Fred and George, who gave Sirius the Veritaserum. She looked across at the twins, who solemnly bowed their heads, their flushing red with shame. She looked across at Dumbledore. Unfortunately, the twins didn't know how dangerous it is for a mole to drink it, he continued. They want to apologize, he added, smiling. The twins did not know. Cecilia paused and trying to assemble her thoughts of realization into words, and looked pointedly at Mrs. Weasley. Did Sirius know? As she spoke, Cecilia tried to inch her way up the bed again, refusing to yield to the pain. When Molly's gaze lowered, she looked at Remus, and read the answer from his expression. Mrs. Weasley approached Cecilia. My dear, I am truly sorry, Fred and George, her voice hardened, are very sorry for their actions. One of the twins opened his mouth as if to say something to his mother, but Mrs. Weasley gave him a look and he thought better of it. She gestured towards Cecilia. We are sorry, Mrs. Frobisher, said Fred, looking at his brother. We really didn't know it would harm you. Finished George. You see, Fred and I thought it would be funny to well, you know. Find something out that was embarrassing, said Fred, looking over at George. We told Sirius, and he talked us into giving it to him and we could listen. He paused, realizing that it wasn't the cleverest thing to have said in front of his mother and headmaster. It was Sirius, clarified George. How dare you? Bellowed Mrs. Weasley. You were going to try it anyway. For a fun. Just look at the consequences of your tomfoolery and mischief, and I am sure Mrs. Frobisher is not laughing. She waved her hand towards Cecilia, and the twins hung their heads in disgrace. I am ashamed to call you my children, she added, folding her arms. Silence reigned for a few minutes, and Cecilia spoke. Thank you for your apology, I value it, she said, nodding at Mrs. Weasley, who looked briefly between Cecilia and Dumbledore before ushering the twins outside. Dumbledore followed them, and moments later they heard Mrs. Weasley begin round 2. It's all so hard to take in, she sighed, turning to Remus after they left. I just don't remember. They sat quietly for a few minutes, and she spoke again. I remember working downstairs with your book. She looked at Mysterious Mythology and glanced at his face momentarily before continuing. He was asking me about my life before I came here. She paused and looked at him again. He rose. I am pleased to see you well again, Cecilia. Madame Pomfrey will be along shortly to give you some more medicine, so I will leave you to your rest. He smiled at Cecilia again, and she noticed a faint tinge of uncertainty flicker across his face before striding towards the door. He paused to look back and saw her head bowed. She was crying. Closing the door he had just opened, Remus sat back down on the edge of the bed and held her hands. Thank you for looking after me, Remus. If it hadn't been for you, she said, her tear-filled eyes looking into his, Sirius would have killed me, wouldn't he? When he didn't reply, Cecilia looked at him. Please, be honest with me, Remus. I am not sure, Cecilia, he said, noticing the slight look of disbelief she gave him. He was in a state, he'd drunk too much, he thought you were a threat to Harry. He sighed, fighting an inner battle between truth and loyalty. However, I did not stop Sirius. It was Snape. He bowed his head slightly, not wanting to look at her. Snape. An image of him filled her mind's eye. He'd stopped her being killed. Please, Remus. Will you tell me everything? I want to know. She looked at him earnestly, and, burying his feelings deep down inside, he nodded. Why? Whispered Cecilia, a quarter of an hour later. She coughed before continuing. It can't just be about Harry. He could have just voted against me at the order meeting. Or just said I couldn't come to the house. Remus shook his head sadly. I am afraid I don't have all the answers. You must understand. Everything Sirius has been through since we left school. He lost his best friends, he went to prison for their murders. He is very protective of Harry, added Remus carefully. I thought he understood the consequences, he continued. I ashamed to call him my friend. Cecilia smiled wanly. She couldn't understand it, she couldn't begin to. She was lying here. She'd nearly died. But where the motive came from. That rang true. What if she had thought Freya was in danger? Wouldn't she do everything in her power to protect her? Not after the last time, continued Remus. Even when he said it. I never thought he'd actually go through with it. But Cecilia wasn't listening now. Severus, she said wearily, continuing to look at him. Where is he? Can I see him? Remus's expression changed from uncomfortable admission to perplexity. He opened his mouth to reply, but just then a knock came at the door. Remus, said Tonks, her silver hair shimmering from the light in the hall as she opened the door. Cecilia. Watcher. Heard you were awake. She looked between Remus and Cecilia. Remus let go of her hand and stood up. I'll leave you to get some rest, he said. I expect Professor Dumbledore will want to speak to you. He made to go, and Tonks grinned, watching him approach her. She winked at Cecilia. See you later, she said, and Remus closed the door. Tonks was waiting for Remus outside. How is she? She asked, as they walked towards the stairs. Fine, in herself, said Remus, wishing Tonks hadn't have turned up at that particular moment. She's having trouble taking it all in. I'd rather not leave her. You've waited with her for the last 4 days, Remus. You deserve a break. Changing the subject, she continued, Sirius hasn't been down from the 3rd floor study since Dumbledore spoke to him. She began to walk towards the stairs. He wants to see her. I don't want him near her, anywhere near her. Remus snapped, and Tonks turned, astonished. You're so kind to do this. It's tired you out, she said. Come on, let's have supper, she added, continuing down the stairs. With a quick glance to the Cecilia's door, Remus followed her. 88,888,888. Cecilia stared at the closed door for a while, thinking. Her head ached as she tried to think. She had been unconscious for 4 days, put there by a man who she was told was on their side. What was it she was doing here? Was it really worth all this? I'll get up, she thought, when I'm able. Walk out of here. Go home. And back into the world. I could do that. Approach the next stranger in the street and tell them what I've been doing for the last 3 weeks. Laugh out loud when I do, knowing I'll never have to think about wizards or magic again. She lay back, running the thought over and over in her mind. Home. Only. Unbidden, she thought back to the words she had spoken in the meeting last Saturday. She'd stood up and spoken them to 20-odd strangers. Why had she done that? Following where her thoughts were leading her, she ran over the possibilities in her mind. And came to the conclusion that it wasn't just to prove her point. She spoke to them, because she actually believed in something she was doing. It was a long time since she had felt like that before. Tim. She knew she was doing the right thing marrying him. And becoming a teacher. That had been the right thing too. The advert she had read 2 months ago popped into her head, "Help save the world." It had said. Then her mind drifted to the picture she'd seen. Last week. She was with Tunks. She replayed what she had done, in her mind's eye. She had found the image. The expression on the man's face. The horror as green sparks shot out from the end of the wand. The triumphant laughter as he fell back, off the balcony. They had killed his daughter too. 8 years old. Same age as Freya. No, thought Cecilia, she couldn't leave now. How could she, knowing that she could stop that happening to others? What sort of person would that make her? If she left, she would be as bad as the monsters that had done that to a child. Worse, in fact. Whatever wrong Sirius Black had done to her, the passive inaction which would come from her choosing the easy option would be in fact worse. If she walked away, she would know that she could have at least done something that could prevent another child's fate being the same. And that was worth it. Ignoring the pain down her side, Cecilia struggled out of bed and switched on the light, picking up Mysterious Mythology from the table beside her and dropping it heavily onto her lap. She turned to page 1, determined to make a start, taking in again the words forming the board around the title page. Energy, magic, light. So he wants me to stop, does he? She thought, as a twinge of pain flicked down her side. It'll take more than that. She managed the first 16 pages, rereading the stories that had delighted wizard children for centuries, no doubt, until exhaustion overcame her. She closed her eyes. No, she concluded, as she drifted off to sleep. I cannot leave. I cannot stay here, but I must continue the work, whatever it takes. When Severus comes back, we can begin again. The words replayed themselves in her mind until she was asleep. 88,888,888. The first thing Cecilia did when she got up painfully the next morning was have a bath, and on returning from her perfect way to wake up despite her feeling sick as she made her way gingerly there, was amazed to find clean bedclothes in place of the tangled covers she had thrown off. She slipped gratefully between the cool sheets, and moments later, there was a knock on the door. In came Tunks, shortly followed by Harry, Ron, and Hermione. She smiled brightly at them. "Morning," said Tunks, beaming. Ron and Hermione were also smiling, however Harry looked rather tense. "Good to see you all," said Cecilia. "How are you?" "Good," said Hermione. "How are you, Mrs. Frobisher?" "Much better," she said, trying not to let what wasn't show on her face. "Hermione has something for you," said Tunks, as they all pulled up chairs near the bed. "Oh?" said Cecilia, hoping it wasn't a get-well-soon card. "It's a get-well-soon card," said Ron, smiling nervous. "A bit silly really, but we thought it might cheer you up." He handed it to Cecilia. The cover was decorated with what seemed to be a cauldron. but with tubes and stars all over it, and inside, all the children, even Fred and George, had written their names. "We did it without magic," said Ron hastily. "We thought you'd like it. Harry suggested we get the cauldron to move, and change the potions." He looked nervously across to Harry, "but we changed our minds." "Thank you," she said, looking round. "It's a really kind thought." "I've got something for you too, Mrs. Frobisher," said Hermione, unfurling the roll of parchment she had in her hand. "I mentioned to the children that for your research you needed to know about wizard families," began Tonks. "Yes," interrupted Hermione. "You needed to know about wizards who had mole or mole-born parents. So I wrote to Mum. She did our family history a few years ago. And I write down what I know about each member." Cecilia looked as Hermione pointed to a family tree and the very detailed expose next to each name. "It might not be what you need," she continued, "but I thought it would help. For instance, my great-grandfather on my mother's side," she pointed to an entry about a third of the way from the top, "Oswald Ashcroft, he ran away to join a circus when he was 13. We have a newspaper report saying he never got injured or ill while he was at the circus, and his conjuring tricks were said to be uncrackable." She handed the parchment to Cecilia. "It might not be what you need," she repeated, but Cecilia nodded. "Thank you, Hermione. You've put a lot of effort in, I see. I am certain it will be valuable." She smiled at Hermione, and Ron smiled too. Harry, however, looked as if he wanted to say something. "Harry?" prompted Cecilia. He opened his mouth to speak, but then shook his head. Cecilia smiled at him, but winced a bit. Her headache had returned. "That's enough excitement for now, kids," said Tonks, noticing Cecilia's tired expression. "You can come back later on, if you wish," said Cecilia, as they rose and headed towards the door. She smiled gratefully at Tonks, who sat down next to her. Just then, Harry turned back. "Mrs. Frobisher," he said. Cecilia looked up at him. "Mrs. Frobisher, are you okay? I mean really okay? It's just that." He stopped and looked around. "Harry," sighed Cecilia. "I feel much better than I did yesterday," she said. "Just please don't let him mention Sirius." "Only Dumbledore said hadn't made up your mind if you were going to continue with the research. And, well, Sirius," he said, then stopped quickly when he saw her face. "When something is decided, Harry, Dumbledore will tell you," said Cecilia levelly, trying her best to smile as Harry looked between both Cecilia and Tonks. He nodded, and left. Cecilia looked down and sighed. "I've got something that will brighten your day a bit," said Tonks, pulling out a catalogue from her back pocket. "Broomstick Monthly. All the latest news from the world of speed flying to Quidditch." She opened it up and placed it on Cecilia's lap. The page which Tonks had opened showed an image of the wizards dressed in what looked like macintoshes and goggles, zoomed around on a broomstick from one corner to another. "This is the one to get," said Tonks, flicking over a couple of pages. "Carbon fiber bristle plate and lightweight handle." She gestured to a rather sleek-looking model. "Plus," she continued, "you get the optional extra glove compartment here on the bristle-molded model." Cecilia nodded. Sometimes, she concluded, letting Tonks get into her stride, anorax had quite a calming effect. 88,888,888. While Tonks was busy raving over bristle per square inch ratios, another conversation began, awaking both the soul and the interest of Phineas Nigellus. "She asked for Snape," said Remus, looking down into his teacup. "She what?" said Bill, looking at his mother. "She wants to see him." "Well, we'd better get him," said Mrs. Weasley. "But Snape, why on earth? After what Sirius has done, can't you think why she'd rather spend time with him?" said Charlie. Where is he, anyway? Order business, for Dumbledore. Mrs. Weasley refilled Charlie's teacup. Sirius? No, Snape. Sirius is in his father's study. Tonks spoke to him earlier. He is sorry for what he did. He wants to see her. Ah, thought Phineas. My flesh and blood. Good thing he has made up with his father, at last. Now, at least, there might be a chance of him marrying Gertrude Hillsrom and continuing the pure bloodline. I don't think that's a very good idea, Remus, not after all this, said Molly. Doesn't he know he almost killed her? Her heart actually stopped beating. If it hadn't been for Madame Pomfrey. So you're suggesting we let her see Snape? Said Remus, looking aghast. I don't see why not. She said she wanted to, and she is working with him, said Molly. Both Bill and Charlie stared at her. But he attacked her, she said so. Remus got to his feet, and walked towards the dresser. Sirius said that, actually. But Snape was holding him up against the wall at that stage. Who's to say that he wasn't making it up? Said Mrs. Weasley. He wasn't. They all looked round. Snape was standing in the kitchen doorway. It's true. I did attack her, he said carefully, scrutinizing the faces before him. But not with intent. Not like Black. He turned quickly to Remus. Didn't I tell you, Lupin, to keep that animal away from her? You knew he was capable of it. He's done it before. You'd know all about that, said Remus stiffly, eyeing him. She wants to see you, said Molly, watching the two wizards carefully. His face unfroze for a second. She's awake, he said, looking at Mrs. Weasley, who nodded. She woke up yesterday. And none of you were about to tell me. Snape broke off, and turned to go, but Remus stepped in front of him. Out of my way, he growled, giving Remus a menacing look. Remus said nothing and stared back. I need to see her. No, said Remus. Molly glanced over to him. Her look asked, why? He sighed and stepping aside, allowing Snape to stride out of the kitchen and up the stairs. 88,888,888. Excellent. That's settled, said Cecilia, smiling at a grinning Tonks. Next time, we're going mole shopping and I won't take no for an answer. What, we're going mole shopping? Shopping for moles? She laughed briefly, trying to contain herself. In that case, I am quite partial to the actor who I once saw in a mole film. Tonks paused for a moment, trying to think. It was about a wood in America and it was haunted by a headless horseman. Cecilia thought for a moment. Sleepy Hollow? She asked. Tonks nodded sheepishly. I used to nip off to the mole cinemas on my days off, she added. Okay, you can buy Johnny Depp, said Cecilia. And I'll have Ewan McGregor, said Cecilia laughing, but just be sure to hide him in at the back of your wardrobe. And if Remus asks, you can just say, what? This old thing? No, had him for ages. They both laughed. Their mirth was interrupted just then when the door opened and Snape marched towards Cecilia. Cecilia, he said, and she noticed the tone of his voice had lost its hard edge. I would have come sooner, only. He paused, noticing Tonks. Miss Tonks, he said, frostily acknowledging her. If you don't mind, he continued, looking back to Cecilia, I need to talk to Mrs. Frobisher. Go right ahead, said Tonks, remaining where she was. Alone, he intoned. Tonks looked between Cecilia and Snape. Yes, said Cecilia, nodding. Are you sure you'll be all right on your own? Snape looked irate, but said nothing. Fine, Tonks, said Cecilia firmly. Okay then, if you're sure, said Tonks, getting to her feet. She gave Snape one last look, then stepped towards the door. Once she had gone, Cecilia looked back to Snape. His arms were folded, and was wearing an expression, as he looked her up and down, that she had never seen before. It looked very much like concern. "Severus, she began, sitting up. This resulted in her slumping forward, coughing. He approached her, but seemed almost at a loss as to what to do. "Black," he said, pacing towards the fireplace. "Look what he's done to you." He paused, and looked back towards her. "If I had not become angry with you, Cecilia, you would not have returned here," he said, his voice breaking a little. "I am as much to blame." He left the sentence hanging in the air. "No," she said. "What happened to me was down to one person alone. How can it be your fault?" Snape approached the bed, and sat on the edge. He looked slightly pained, as if trying to decide on what to say. "I know the effects of Veritaserum on moles, Cecilia. It is a wonder that you survived. Do you remember what happened when you were at Hogwarts?" Cecilia sighed. "He is blaming himself for this because he lost his temper," she thought to herself. She steeled herself to be as pragmatic as she could. "I do, Severus. But your losing your temper with me has nothing to do with why I am lying here. What I don't understand is why try to kill me? He could easily have stopped me in other ways." "Black cares about no one but himself," said Snape, bitterly. "He wanted his fun with you, Cecilia." He stopped. Cecilia waited for him to continue. "What?" she said, when he didn't. Snape sighed. "Black is very much the womanizer, but his feelings towards moles, well." He broke off and Cecilia nodded, recalling how he had acted around her on the evening of the meeting. "Like an object, not a person." "Hermione gave me this," she said, sitting up in bed. She pointed to the scroll of paper lying on the floor near the bed. Snape picked it up. "It's her family tree. I think this will help us when it comes to genetics." Snape stared back at her. "Well, that's the Mole word for it. It is to do with the parts of you that are passed down in the family, from your parents and grandparents." She noticed Snape stiffen slightly. "And I looked at mysterious mythology again," she added, showing him the notes. He said nothing. "Severus?" she asked. "You really wish to continue?" said Snape, looking straight into her eyes. "After what you have been through?" Cecilia looked down. "I thought about quitting," she said. "The easiest thing in the world would be to go home, forget about all this." She sighed. "But the people I'd pass in the street every day, live next door to, talk to in the greengrocer's about the price of apples." She paused. They could be next. Them, or their families. It brought it home to me, Severus, sitting in the meeting with the rest of the order. Snape looked at her, and nodded slightly. "When you are ready, when you are well, we should to discuss your idea of genetics," he said. "No," she thought, "I've had enough of being mollycoddled." "How about now?" she asked, and ignoring his expression she swung her legs over the edge of the bed. An hour later and their discussion had reached practicalities. Snape had provided parchment and had made notes on what she said, pausing every so often to make sure she was comfortable. The results had been more than Cecilia could have hoped for, and Snape had been able to grasp the basic understanding of reproduction of cells and DNA. They had spoken about Hermione's family tree, and she expressed her admiration for her because of her astute understanding of inheritance. Then she began to question Snape about wizards. "It has long been held that what is passed down through families manifests itself within the witch or wizard," said Snape. "However, if wizards marry moles, their children are wizards, but they take on something from the mole parent." He rose to his feet. "Even if it is undetectable in the wizard themselves, it is there." "Like a stigma," thought Cecilia, grimly. "If you have moles in your heritage, it's like you are not truly a wizard." No wonder there was someone mad enough to come along with ideas like this Dark Lord. And no wonder so many wizards listen. Because it is what they all believe, deep down. As if reading her mind, Snape looked at her. The children are wizards, nonetheless, he said, but to them it feels like they're neither one nor the other. They cannot fit into either world easily. Cecilia nodded, trying to put him at his ease, wondering vaguely how he knew this. He got up from beside her and walked towards the fireplace, before turning and continuing. Even if they live in the wizard world, the mole part of them always calls them back once in a while, telling them they don't quite belong. That's why Hermione Granger works so hard, in order to prove herself. And you, he said, glancing across to Cecilia. A mole in our world. I have to admit, Severus, this is actually me. I was like this before, so being in the wizard world has no bearing on the approach I am taking. She looked down, and tears began to well in her eyes. This was her, bloody hell. Not some zealous reaction to the situation she was in. Was that the reason then, that Sirius had not stopped at just scaring her off? Because he thought she had a point to prove? She realized she'd said her thoughts aloud, and Severus sat down next to her on the bed. She flinched when he touched her arm. Just a bruise, she said, rolling up the sleeve of her nightie to rub it. Severus stared at the yellowing bruise that covered almost half of her upper arm. Black! Bellowed Snape, through gritted teeth. He got to his feet and strode purposefully towards the door. Look what he's done to you. Look what I've done to you myself. You would never have come away from Hogwarts. You were safe there. But you lost your temper, said Cecilia. No, don't go, she said, as he turned the door handle. It was a reaction to something, nothing more. What he did, it was premeditated. She looked at Snape, determined to make him realize. He planned it, he intended to kill me. I know the difference, Severus, and I don't care what anyone else says. He paused and turned back to look at Cecilia. Do you still want me back? To work, that is? She asked quickly. Are we making progress? Is what we're doing worthwhile? Or, she thought to herself, am I just upsetting too many people's lives by being here? Those of the Order, the children, you. We have a lead, he replied. A good one. If we can take it further, we will have a firm head start. He walked away from the door, and sat on a chair, facing Cecilia. The Dark Lord is strong now, stronger than he was the last time, and his followers are increasing. He swallowed. The chances we have are few, but they are strong, because he does not suspect the means by which we can develop new weapons to use against him. It is worthwhile to all of us, Cecilia. She nodded, and it occurred to her how honest he had been. The only one, bar Dumbledore, to have been honest with her since she arrived. She was just about to ask how he knew about the Dark Lord when Mrs. Weasley came in carrying a tea tray, and she was shortly followed by Dumbledore. Molly laid the tray down on Cecilia's table, and began to pour. I thought you might like some of this, being as Poppy said you shouldn't eat anything for another day, she said. She will be up later, to see how you are, she added, before nodding at Dumbledore. Cecilia, said Dumbledore, sitting on a chair next to her, you look much better than when I saw you last. How are you feeling? Much better, Professor, she replied, and Dumbledore nodded. I need to ask you whether you have decided if you wish to continue with your research? Yes, I do want to continue. In actual fact, we have made some progress this afternoon. She looked over at Snape. Indeed, he confirmed. We have made some deep connections upon which we can build. He glanced back over to Cecilia. In that case, I need to reassign you, Severus. You must progress with the research alone while Cecilia recovers. I know it is much to ask, but it will be in addition to your other work. He turned to Cecilia. Poppy says your recovery is remarkable and you will be able to return to Hogwarts within the next few days, should you feel able. He nodded back at Cecilia, but she shook her head. No, Professor, she said. I cannot stay here. If you wish me to continue my work with Severus, I must return to Hogwarts now. I feel well enough, but I can't stay here any longer. She looked across at Snape. You require the work to be continued as soon as possible, she continued. And besides, no one knows the effects of this Veritaserum on moles. What does it matter if I am here or there? Dumbledore was about to say something, but Snape spoke first. If I may say, Professor, I agree with Cecilia. We need to begin as soon as possible. He smiled slightly at her before continuing. Should you require it, I will ensure Poppy visits her daily. Cecilia coughed slightly, and smiled inwardly, realizing that more than one connection had been forged that day. Very well, said Dumbledore, nodding. I entrust Cecilia to your care, Severus. He walked towards the door. Your work is indeed important, to everyone's lives. I am heartened that you have made this decision. When Dumbledore and Mrs. Weasley had left, Snape looked around her room. I want you to know I think your decision is brave, he said, turning back. But before she could reply, the door opened. Cecilia, said Remus. You're leaving? Are you okay? Of course she is, Snape spat, staring at Remus. Why wouldn't she be? Because of the harm you did her last time she went off with you, retorted Remus. Cecilia looked between them both, and then looked down. He didn't mean it, Remus, said Cecilia, and turned to Snape. I know it. And besides, we need to continue work. Snape exhaled pointedly and looked at Remus. So if you don't mind, he added, victoriously. But Remus remained where he was. Sirius would like to see you, he said, looking at Cecilia. How dare you? Said Snape. Does he know what he's done? Remus ignored Snape and approached her. He opened his mouth to say something and Cecilia looked at him questioningly when he didn't. She didn't notice him stride back towards the bed and she jumped. Why are you leaving with Snape? He eventually managed, and Cecilia glanced at Snape, whose eyes were bulging in fury. Because I need to continue this work, she said, adamantly. And I feel safer at Hogwarts than I do here. There, she'd said it. She hadn't wanted to be so blunt with Remus, but his insistence in sticking up for Sirius was the limit. Cecilia, please. Don't go. She looked up into Remus's pale eyes, illuminated with surprise. Why, Remus? She said, her voice increasing in volume and resonance. Don't you realize that my very being here is enough to remind me what your so-called friend did? And by your very admission, had Severus not arrived last week, I wouldn't even be here to realize that? She exhaled, and not even the wounded expression on Remus's face made her regret saying it. Without saying another word, he glanced between Cecilia and Snape, and went from the room. I am afraid if we are to leave today, we must travel by Floo, said Snape. I can disapparate your belongings again, however. I will return later, when you are ready to leave. Cecilia nodded. Thank you, she said, grateful to be left for now, as her ribs began to ache again. He looked across at her and nodded slightly before leaving Cecilia on her own. 88,888,888. It was the afternoon when she awoke to find Madame Pomfrey in the room, and realized she had dozed off over mysterious mythology. Acknowledging her impending departure to Hogwarts, she discussed the side effects of which Cecilia should be aware, but told her that they were not accurate because she knew of no cases where a mole had ever survived. She explained that Cecilia must not consume any food for at least another day, because Veritaserum may still be in her system. Soon after, Poppy left and Cecilia eased herself out of bed, changing into something comfortable and packing up the rest of her belongings. Then she noticed Mysterious Mythology. She looked at the front cover again, and flicked open the first page. She knew it was valuable, not intrinsically so, but she really wanted to leave it behind. What use was it anyway, if they had started looking at genetics? And besides, it reminded her so of Remus. Who in turn reminded her of Sirius. Placing the book down on the table, she opened the bag of clothes she had bought from Madame Mimos's shop with Tunks and recalled the fun she had choosing those lovely things. Folding them up, she looked back at Mysterious Mythology. In for a penny, in for a pound, she thought. I still don't know that it is of no use. Just as she was packing it away, there came a knock at the door. It was Remus. "If you're going to try to talk me out of this," said Cecilia, looking up as he walked in, "it won't work." She zipped her bag closed, and looked defiantly at him. "It was wrong of me to mention Sirius." He walked over to her, taking in her hunched stature. "It is for the best," she said carefully. He looked down, and then straight into her eyes. "But Snape," he began. "I trust him," she replied firmly. "You trust him? Heavens above, Cecilia, he's about the worst person you could trust." "And yet I do." "And what's the alternative?" She shook her head. "I'm going today, no matter what, whether it's with Severus, or whether I quit and go back to my world." She looked down. "Why can't you understand?" she thought to herself. "Why do you insist I stay here?" "Forgive me," he said, walking back to the door. "It is not my place to question you." She sighed again. He took the knob, and going to close it behind him. "Remus," she said, as he retreated. "Why?" he said, forcefully, looking up. She paused to catch her breath before continuing. "Because I couldn't live with the person I'd be if I didn't." 88,888,888. Not long after, she was visited by Mrs. Weasley, Bill, Charlie and Tunks to see her off. Cecilia was glad when they didn't make a fuss, and Tunks said she would call in to see her at Hogwarts. She gave Cecilia a letter which had arrived that afternoon. Her heart soared when she realized it was from Libby, and she had to fight the desire to open it now and scribble a reply. When the door opened moments later, she was pleased to see it was Snape, and she smiled, knowing it wouldn't be long till she was out of this place. "Are you ready?" he said, approaching her. She nodded, and there was a crack as he disapparated her luggage. Just then she turned, looking at the door through which she could hear voices. "She can't have disapparated. You can't into Hogwarts, can you?" said Hermione, in a knowing voice. "See, I told you she hadn't gone yet," said Hermione, gesturing towards Cecilia. When neither Ron nor Harry acknowledged her comment, she frowned, and Ron screwed up his face in her direction. "We came to say goodbye," said Harry, and the others nodded. "Thanks," she said, smiling, and extended it to the others. "Goodbye," she said, stepping towards the hearth beside Snape, holding onto his arm, but he pulled her closer and held her waist. She waited for the concertina effect to take hold, and she looked momentarily through the green flames. Within seconds, they were standing in the hearth of her room at Hogwarts. She looked around briefly, then her knees buckled as the nausea swept over her. Without saying anything, Snape picked her up and placed her carefully on the bed before striding out. "Thank you," she managed, and he flicked a smile towards her before leaving. She lay on the bed for a few moments, waiting for the dizziness to pass, and her thoughts jumped around, as they sailed through into her mind. It eventually cleared and she yawned. Her headache, which she had recently begun to regard as an unwelcome house guest, began to build up in her temples, and she sighed, contemplating its annoying presence. Suddenly, across a blank part of her mind, Remus strolled casually, and she thought back to the brief conversation they had last had. Why on earth did he care so much about her staying there? He's tried twice today to convince her not to return to Hogwarts. It was obvious he was protecting his friend, but surely her departure to Hogwarts wouldn't have made that much of a difference. He said Sirius was sorry. That was all well and good. And even if she had have seen him, what good would it have done her staying at Grimmauld Place? If Sirius still wanted to stop her, he could have. Why would that require her to stay there? Why did Remus want her to stay? Unless his loyalty to Sirius did him credit. Was that the reason he wanted her to stay, though? She considered how he had been with her. He'd been with her constantly when she was unconscious, and the look he had given her when she'd lost her temper with him was heartbreaking. She dismissed the idea, adamant that Remus wouldn't have tried to harm her too.